Good day, my name is Adelaide and I will be discussing the adequacy of legislation to protect marine life from seismic survey noise. I would like to start off by explaining what seismic surveys are, and these are either 2D, 3D or 4D techniques that are used to explore for hydrocarbons in the seabed. These techniques include the use of air gun arrays, which are towed on a separate vessel and are fired in quick succession. Unfortunately, these air gun arrays are very sound intensive and emit low frequency sound at sources of about 262 decibels. This low frequency sound travels over long distances of approximately 4,000 kilometers from the source. Seismic surveys have been used in South Africa since the 20th century, but because of the expanding population, the demand for adequate energy supply has been on the increase, and as such, South Africa is a big importer of oil. Government initiatives such as Operation Phakisa have further accelerated the rate of offshore oil extraction with the intention of growing the country's GDP from 54 billion rand in 2010 to 170 billion rand by the year 2023. This offshore oil extraction brings forth plenty advantages, for example, employment opportunities, but is also met with controversy. And the controversy thereon is what I will be discussing now when looking at the impact of seismic survey noise on marine species. Before looking at the impact thereon, we first need to understand the importance of sound to marine species. The sea becomes darker and darker the further one moves away from the surface of the water, and this is because the sea is a poor conductor of light, but an excellent conductor of sound, with little to no light penetrating 20 feet beneath the surface of the water. As a result, marine species primarily depend on their sense of hearing to perform essential daily activities, such as the detection of prey or the calling of mates. In Southall et al., concern was raised that seismic surveys have deleterious effects on the health of marine mammals, especially cetaceans, and can even contribute to strandings. But there is limited data to support these findings. In 2016, after seismic surveys had been conducted along the Durban shore in KwaZulu-Natal, numerous marine mammals were fatally stranded on the shore, and there was speculation that seismic survey noise could be the culprit. Experts such as Pruden, in her 2018 article, indicate that air gun noise causes severe internal injuries to fish and the endangered African penguin. Researchers such as Serban in his 2016 article and Russells in his 2018 report on the impacts of seismic surveys on South African fisheries argue that the impacts of seismic surveys on fish could lead to lower fishing catches in areas where seismic surveys have been conducted. This therefore leads to conflicts between the petroleum and commercial fishing industry, especially in South Africa, which is a coastal country where commercial fishing is a lucrative source of income. Seismic surveys therefore pose a threat to this industry. Moreover, the impact of seismic survey noise on fish will also then limit food resources for marine mammals and humans alike, and this will also create a threat towards food security. It has also been documented that marine vertebrates communicate at low frequencies similar to those emitted during seismic surveys. This could therefore cause masking and interfere with crucial activities such as mate calling or the detecting of prey. Now, to look at whether the South African regulations are adequate to protect marine life from seismic survey noise, I would like to start off by looking at the international law mandate that is imposed on South Africa to regulate seismic survey noise. By doing that, I will then look at global and regional instruments. Under the global instruments, I will look at 4 major instruments, and those are the UNCLOS, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, as well as the ESPO Convention. Under the UNCLOS, which is the primary instrument regulating activities conducted in the marine environment, according to Article 56 and 77, state parties may explore and exploit the resources in their continental shelf and exclusive economic zones. However, this is not an absolute right, because state parties must, for example, protect the marine environment from pollution, they must conserve marine mammals, and they must monitor activities that are likely to cause pollution. The definition in Article 1.4 of UNCLOS includes energy as a pollutant, which would then mean that noise is regulated there. Under UNCLOS, state parties must also conduct environmental assessments when they suspect that activities for the exploration and exploitation of resources will result to significant harm to the environment. State parties must also conduct environmental impact assessments and publish the results thereof. However, UNCLOS does not give us a criteria for what these environmental impact assessments should look like. Under the CBD, which was formed with the aim of conserving biodiversity and protecting it from pollution, state parties, or conference parties rather, are required to conduct environmental assessments when they are embarking in projects that can cause harm to biodiversity. The environmental assessment process must also then allow for adequate public participation. However, most of the regulations or guidelines formed by the conference party to the CBD are soft laws, and therefore parties may decide not to comply with these. Furthermore, under the CMS, parties are required to conserve and protect migratory species. Similarly to the CBD, under the CMS, there are a lot of resolutions that have been adopted which encourage parties to conduct environmental impact assessments, especially on the impact of seismic survey noise to the marine environment. Parties are also encouraged to take all measures necessary to mitigate any environmental harm arising from seismic survey. Under the ESPO Convention, Article 2 states that parties must conduct environmental impact assessments prior to performing activities that may adversely affect the environment. Appendix 1 and 2 therefore sets out the criteria for seismic surveys. Under regional instruments, we have the Abidjan and the Nairobi Convention, as ratified by South Africa. Both conventions define pollution in a similar way to UNCLOS that then allows for the regulation of seismic survey noise. In the 2017 draft protocol for the Abidjan Convention, parties are required to prevent pollution emanating from offshore exploration and exploitation operations, and they must then adopt the precautionary principle. The Nairobi Convention requires that its conference parties must regulate and control activities conducted in the seabed that can harm or disturb fauna. Unfortunately, parties to the conventions have not adopted guidelines on how EMAs or environmental impact assessments should be conducted or how to minimize seismic survey noise. Now looking at the South African regulatory measures, I would like to start off by looking at the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. In terms of Section 24, legislative and other measures must be adopted to prevent pollution and ecological degradation, as well as to promote conservation and enable sustainable development to be carried forth. Under NEMA, which is the primary legislation that was enacted to give effect to Section 24, it therefore regulates the protection of the environment from pollution. Section 2 lists some principles that protect the environment, and under Section 2, subsection 4a, it is stated that the disturbance of ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity must be avoided, and where this cannot be avoided, harm must be minimized and remedied. Section 24 also then states that when an intended activity is said to be carried forth and may harm the environment, an environmental assessment must be conducted and mitigation measures must be implemented. Under the NEMA Environmental Impact Assessment Regulations of 2014, environmental impact assessments must be conducted, and these will then include environmental impact assessments and environmental impact scoping reports before offshore petroleum extraction activities are then allowed. These regulations set out the standard that EMAs must follow, which includes the mitigation measures that will be applied to limit the risk to the environment and to biodiversity. Seismic surveys are not allowed, for instance, in protected areas, and during the environmental assessment process, sufficient public participation must be carried forth. For example, a 30-day notice to the public and them being given an ability to comment on the likely effect to the environment. However, the NEMA regulatory regime does not specifically deal with underwater noise. The regulations that control noise seem to only focus on the terrestrial environment and the impacts of noise on human health, not necessarily on marine life. Furthermore, under the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, Section 5A states that no one may explore for or produce any mineral or petroleum without acquiring environmental authorization and an exploration right. In order to ascertain the above, an environmental management program must be submitted. The Petroleum Agency of South Africa is responsible for granting licenses to conduct offshore seismic surveys. And before an exploration right is granted, an environmental assessment must be conducted and the environmental reports must be submitted to the agency. The agency requires stakeholders in the Petroleum Agency to adopt mitigation measures similar to the UK's JNCC guidelines in order to mitigate the impacts of their activities on the environment. This then brings us to the question whether the current regulations under South African law are adequate. Although the Petroleum Agency SA has argued that in the 5 decades that seismic surveys have been conducted, no major effects to marine mammals or other marine life have been reported, scientists argue that this is because the impacts of seismic survey noise have not been studied sufficiently in South Africa. Furthermore, it is also argued that it is not enough to simply copy the regulations of other jurisdictions, for example, these JNCC guidelines, because some jurisdictions have actually criticized these JNCC guidelines. For example, New Zealand has gone above and beyond the JNCC guidelines to ensure the protection of their biodiversity. Scholars have also argued that SA needs to adopt its own country-specific seismic survey guidelines, which will then be entrenched into legislation that will then offer protection to its endangered species. For example, the African penguin, which has depleted significantly over the past few years. Furthermore, it is also submitted that perhaps a bigger mitigation zone than 500 meters would then need to be adopted, or a longer or softer or shorter duration of the soft start protocols that then meets the current needs of South Africa. Furthermore, public participation needs to be more closely monitored. It is therefore submitted that although the current South African regulations do protect marine life from seismic surveys to an extent, more needs to be done to ensure the overall protection of our biodiversity. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time.